You may stay. If you go, we know why. Thanks everybody for hanging around for my one. I was presenting in front of 200 odd people yesterday, and that was easy. Today is a totally different biscuit. Thanks everybody. My study has come a long way in the last 5 or 6 months. I actually feel on less firm ground now than I did at the beginning, but for very good reasons. So it's a positive thing, but because I've realised how much more finessing and sharpening of theory, method, etc., etc. So it's a good thing, but I'm feeling less sure, but for a good reason. So I'm looking at adaptive expertise and teacher career well-being. The adaptive expertise part sort of came first. I was already sitting with that before. And the teacher's career well-being is more recent, and I've got a lot more reading to do around that. But it was the well-being part that really gave the reason why I'm looking into the adaptive expertise. So we're looking for the value proposition, and that's sort of come up that way around. So I've got I've got these things coming up. So it's a fairly standard presentation, just a bit of introduction, which will bleed into the context and field side of things, and you can see the rest there. I don't think you're supposed to have one of these, but I've got like a pre-research hunch. This sort of sets up, why I'm going in there. I can't call it a hypothesis because I'm not allowed to have a hypothesis. I might come up with one, but I'm not allowed one at the moment. So adaptive expertise not only supports teacher effectiveness, but contributes to lower stress and higher levels of well-being for teachers. I've got a feeling that could be the case, so I'm going to explore around that, and if that sort of gives me anything of value, then that will be the value add in the study. I've started off just using this one study just to give you an idea about where all of this fits together, and it's looking at teacher well-being. If you start with the teacher's intentional risk of quitting, then Wang, Hall and Rahimi say that if you've got positive feelings of self-efficacy, then that lowers that intention. If you have a perceived personal control over the stresses that occur during the course of a person doing teaching, then that lessens the intentions or the risks of quitting. But if you attribute stress simply to internal factors, and the word simply I'll explain in a moment, then that actually increases the measured intention of risk of quitting. Also, self-efficacy, feelings of self-efficacy give better psychological and physical health, and similar sorts of patterns around perceived personal control over stresses. You get better measures of emotional exhaustion. That is to say that the measures are lower. Exhaustion is reported at lower levels. Job satisfaction is reported to be better, and symptoms of illness report to be better in that you get less symptoms of illness. And just to finish off that story, attribution of simple stress, of stress simply to internal factors, you get worse measures of exhaustion, depersonalization issues, and also symptoms of illness are made worse by that. Now, the word simply means there if a person perceives that the stress is due to internal factors but has no strategies to deal with that. The simply part is that they don't feel that they can do something to counter or act against that stress. So they simply perceive that the stress is internal, but they don't know what to do about it. That's what that means. Under the banner of well-being, better self-efficacy, feelings of being in control of stresses, and also understanding strategies to deal with stressing factors, then comes the part about the experts. And I'm using two different types of expertise as originally written about by Hatano and Inagaki. I don't know if that's the correct way of saying that. Starting with routine experts, which we can quite easily see that routine experts have outstanding measures of the speed at which they operate, the accuracy at which they problem solve within the context, the way they've got automaticity in that they've got routines that they can pull out and use really quickly, and they can automatically do them. There's a lot of tacit skills involved in being a routine expert, and they have particular mental models that are convenient to the way in which they do routine tasks. By routine tasks means ones that the person that we would label to be the expert has seen a lot of, and it has become a routine procedure because of practice over time. The other type of expert is called an adaptive expert, and various authors have said there's a big distinction between the adaptive process and the routine processes that you see within the way in which the expert teacher operates. So they tend to be more adaptive and develop the processes to suit changes. They actively seek improvement, so they have that sort of lifelong learning approach towards improving their practice over time. In fact, they'll be the sort of teacher that you see will deliberately go and find a new method and then just to see if it works because they have that capacity. They're more flexible, and they have deeper understanding of teaching. In fact, Berliner and Glasser would say that they have different ways of setting up mental models related to their teacher knowledge and their knowledge about how things work in the classroom. So adaptive expertise, what are you adaptive to? You're adaptive to changes in context, changes in demand, changes in requirements. And that can be on a large scale, such as the curriculum changes, or you've got a new class, or it can be on the minute by minute, second by second changes that happen in a classroom where you get a challenge and you can work out maybe a new way of reformulating something very quickly to be able to use in the context. Now, one of the things that adaptive experts do really well in common with routine experts is that adaptive experts will take a procedure that they have generated as a new or modified process, and they will practice and routinize that, because by making it into a routine, that gives them spare capacity back, spare energy. They don't have to be thinking about it because they've made it tacit. They can just use it again. So that goes away into the toolbox. That's now a routine that they can use, and now they've got their spare capacity to go forwards. Routine experts do that sort of thing as well, but a routine expert will then not necessarily use that spare capacity. They'll do other things with it, whereas the adaptive expert will then be looking for the next challenge or the next modification or the next improvement. So that's how that also fits together. So these two things I'm putting up against each other. We've got adaptive expertise and the factors contributing to well-being, and in doing that, my study fits in the middle, where I'm looking at where those two things overlap, because I think one serves the other. So my research aim is to contribute new knowledge about the relationship between teachers' adaptive expertise, their well-being, and teachers' professional contexts. Context being the systems that they work in, the schools that they work in, the classes that they work in. And the research questions, and this is the part where, I've got to a certain stage. I'm reasonably happy with where I've got to, but there's a lot of work in honing this still, I think. I don't think they're sharp enough. How does teachers' activity of using adaptive expertise relate to their experience of change-related stressors and the likelihood of resultant harmful stress? So that's a gobful. But so we're looking at, I'm particularly interested in the activity part of it, and you'll see why in a moment. So I'm going to be looking at what's actually happening when a teacher is actually doing something that is in relation to a change that's happening in their context. What's their experience of that? Number two, what contextual factors are involved in the process of a teacher's developing and using adaptive expertise within a changing, a dynamic and potentially stressful professional context? I say potentially stressful because the stresses will be created, but it's what happens next as to whether that becomes actually a harmful form of stress, or whether it's just a stressor that's then been adequately dealt with and then the teacher moves on. So potentially stressful is important. Number 3, how do teachers' conceptions of the nature and utility of adaptive expertise align with those assumed by professional teacher mentors, teacher leaders, teacher accreditation processes, schools, and those found in research literature? So does the teacher's conception of adaptive expertise match those of everybody else that's in the scenario, including those people that may be measuring and judging them? So there's the 3 research questions. As far as theoretical perspectives go, again, a lot of work to do here, but basically if I'm looking at feelings of self-efficacy, perceived personal control, and the attributes around stress as far as the internal factors of the teacher are concerned, I'm interested in the teacher's experiences. So I'm obviously looking at these sorts of things, their perceptions, their emotions, and their understanding. And so that leads me to be working within in general terms, working within interpretive constructivist, because I want to be talking to teachers and helping them construct the story for me, I suppose, and that sits in the qualitative. Although I think there will be maybe some elements in collecting data that will be quantitative, but basically it's going to be a qualitative sort of approach. As far as methodology and methods are concerned, there's a bit of detail in this. I'm going to be using activity theory. Now, activity theory has got quite a history to it, and other people have alluded to parts of it during the course of time this morning. In the first generation of activity theory, we're talking about in the early 1900s, 1920s, that sort of time span, when you've got Vygotsky. Vygotsky's activity theory, although set in a social context, was really looking at the activity within the individual. Leontev, who worked with Vygotsky and carried on with Vygotsky's work along with some others like Luria, put that really into the socially situated activity, that activity being something that happens within very heavily within a social context. The first generation activity theory comes out of basically a subject wants to do something to an object to come out with an outcome, and they're going to use some form of tool. A mediating artifact is a tool. It may be a type of language, it might be some codification, it may be some physical artifact, maybe it's a physical tool. So that the first generation activity theory was around that sort of time. As time has gone on, we've put these things into even more of a social context, where the context, the word context was in my research questions. The context is the community, so it might be the school, professional organisation, it may be the students, the parents, all the people that are involved, professional networks, etc. The rules, they're things like school policies, the curriculum, the professional accreditation rules, etc. Division of labour is who else is involved in the activity that's being carried out, and how basically are the tasks split up amongst other members of the community. So I'm interested in the way in which expertise is experienced by teachers when they're actually working in their context. So that means the reason why I like activity theory is it lets me look at all the other things that are around the teacher, rather than just completely focusing maybe on the psychological or within the boundaries of one person and their actions. I originally started looking at, this is several years ago, looking at this idea of expertise, and I found that what I didn't want to simplify for the sake of collecting data. I didn't want to simplify the situation by stripping off bits and assuming they didn't matter. So I liked activity theory because it meant I could take care of the context that sat around the person I would be talking to or the people that I would be working with. An example of that is, for example, if a teacher's dealing with a change, say for example a change in their class or a change in their curriculum, and the idea is that they want to come out with a successful outcome. This is the object or the objective or the goal of the activity. So the subject is the teacher themselves, and they're actually using their expertise or their skill set in order to bring that about. So that's one part of the activity. And then I can plug in the rest of it, as I said before, parts of the community and the rule sets and the division of labour. Now, the changes that are happening can be changes that are happening in other parts of the context. The community can change. The teacher might go to a different school or have a different class. The division of labour could change because they're given a different role, or the leadership in their school changes, or something like that. So it's a very dynamic way of dealing with change. The other thing I like about the activity theory approach is that within the context with these 6-7 entities, you can get a lot of what are called contradictions or tensions. So for example, you might have some things where the subject is actually confined by certain rules. That means that it makes it more difficult to actually do the action on the object to come out with the outcome. So all of these dotted lines are sort of where things can all the tensions can occur. The most important thing about this, going back to the idea of the dialectic sort of approach towards how systems evolve or how systems change, is that if you get a tension between two things and you resolve that tension, you've actually come up with a new solution. So those sorts of principles that you can see in action even when you're looking at things like evolution, but where the way systems change. And Engstrom calls those sorts of situations expansive learning, where you get tensions, you resolve the tension, and therefore you make the system different or changed or improved. So that the learning is the improvement process that comes out of that. So at the moment, I'm thinking about what's called instrumental case study. It's instrumental in that you're not so concerned with the accurate description of the actual case that you're looking at is important, but you're actually more looking at the activity or the processes involved in there in order to generalize about the process itself. So you're actually looking at the case of the activity, not the case necessarily of that particular teacher in that particular context. So it's a way of allowing you to generalize a little bit from that. It's just a different approach. I think at the moment a lot of what I'll be doing interviews, probably following on from observations that I do in classrooms, where looking at teachers, how they operate within environments that might change. And also I'd like to be interviewing teacher leaders, because I need to be looking at this area here. So the teacher leaders, teachers' colleagues, and other people in the system, I need to sort of talk to them as well. Video, I think video has a bit of promise within the context of classroom observations. And then in order to look at the context in a lot of detail, I think I need to look at the sorts of policies that are there as well. So what are and that's really this area here, looking at the rule sets that people operate within. So by the time we put all that together, and I think it'll be a growing situation where I'll go and gather some data, and then that'll suggest other areas that I'll need to go and get data to enlarge the picture and to make the thing clearer. So there is a third generation of activity theory, which I may not have time to get to, but I think is interesting, and that's where you get the contradiction, but between different systems that actually have common elements. Let's say, for example, successful teaching outcomes is a common element of the way in which 8SOR wants to do your professional certification. So that's an activity system in its own right. It has a common outcome with the teacher trying to deal with change, but you can get, and this is where you might have a difference in interpretation between what does a teacher think expertise is compared with what AITSL might define expertise to be, whether those two things line up. Are there any contradictions in there to be aware of? I think this is a really interesting place to have a look. Whether my study will get that far, I'm not sure. Within the context of an EdD, there may not be time to do that. But that's where Engstrom's work has gone into that bigger scenario where you've got networks of activity systems. A lot of Engstrom's work, and those that have followed his sort of methodologies, they look at the boundaries between activity systems, because that's a very fruitful place to look at developments. Yeah. So contribution to scholarship. If I'm looking at the way in which I sort of did this as a sketch the other evening, just thinking, oh, just something nice to put on a slide, but there's actually a little bit of potential there to model some of the ways in which expertise works, because you can get, if I've got expertise that deals really well with stresses in the teacher's context, then that's the adaptive expertise in there. That means I can deal with things adequately because I can change. I'm at a high level of expertise, but I can also change my procedures in result of change, and that's where my well-being will come out from. So I accidentally ended up with maybe a promising diagram. So as far as professional contributions are concerned, I'm looking maybe to generate some form of advice for teachers, educators and schools and systems. Now I think this also will be useful if this is something that is valid, then it's obviously worthwhile getting pre-service teachers well aware of the fact that if they can work on this type of approach towards their skill sets, then they will serve themselves better and avoid things like burnout and teacher stress and all those sorts of things later on. So improving teacher preparation to support well-being is a professional contribution there. As far as academic contributions are concerned, obviously add to the literature on teacher expertise, because this is a combination of factors in a slightly different mix of contexts or different mix of factors. The literature on stress and well-being, and also the specific use of an instrumental case study method using activity theory for teacher research, because it'll be a model of how to do that sort of thing. So that's about it. That's my study sitting in there. Thank you very much.
David, I would like to respond in any way as a supervisor.
Without copying.
Yeah.
The last thing I said to Karen was I cough when I talk.
Yeah. So I don't know whether you want to speak or not.
Alex, I think you've come a long way from when we first met, and it's still evolving. So even in the last couple of weeks I've been away from it just to see as it's all starting to come together. Do you want to share what your professional capacity is in this? So, like, where you come from as a person in this study? What's driving that part of it?
Yeah, well, I'm a head of teaching and learning, and I have a lot to do with in-service PD for teachers, and I obviously know I do classroom observations and all those sorts of things. So I'm sitting in a secondary school where I've got teachers that are currently stressing their brains out, rewriting, actually writing for the first time curriculum, because most teachers most of the time don't write curriculum. They generally adapt, modify and review. That's the process. They're not very often coming in and writing from scratch a brand new piece of set of units. Well, they got 2 years, well actually 3 years worth of units that they're writing. So these teachers are heavily stressed under strain. Now, they're dealing with it because we're making it our job to help them deal with it. But you can see that there's a lot of tension, and that's a big scale change. And I know, just looking at the stats, that there's a lot of disputed stats around burnout. Like they talk about 40-50% of teachers burn out and leave the profession in the first 5 years, etc., etc. the data's not necessarily come from Australia, but it is still a significant issue. So I'm seeing teachers who deal with change all the time. Even just taking a teacher who ordinarily is a math science teacher and having to put them in a rave lesson, that's a change. Like all of a sudden they're not in their bubble of expertise anymore. So that's a change. So I'm interested. My background is I'm really interested in the expertise part of it. The bit that Dave and Alberto pushed me towards is considering how do you make that valuable in the context of professional and academics, and that's where the well-being thing is less than 6 weeks ago that I suddenly thought, what about teacher stress? Because if you're more adaptive, doesn't that make you less vulnerable to stress? Because you know, especially if you know you can change. I think that comes out from that very shallow lit review of one example of one study that says that if you have more perception about how you can internally relate to and make changes, then you are. It's not going to cure, but it's going to lessen your eventual stress from being.
You said that you know you can change. I think it's do you have the strategies to change?
Yeah.
And then that fills in that top box,
Yeah.
the triangle, that you have these tools to deal with the change.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the whole point of the activity triangle is the fact that as you go through, like it's cultural, the other name for activity theory is cultural historical activity theory. So the culture is built over time. The artifacts are developed over time. And that's because it's very much a dynamic process. You're not just saying, let's walk into this class and look at it right now. You want to know how did that develop over time? Where did that practice come from? But within the context of this study, I want to know how the teacher feels about that. Does the teacher know about that? How do they formulate? How's their knowledge base? Do they identify when they actually did change the strategy? And that's where some of the suggestion was that you could video a lesson and then get a teacher to watch the video with you and identify when changes have occurred and where they've used particular processes. Now, how aware are they of that? So there's still a lot of sharpening up to do of that, so it makes all the things line up. So you're finding out about what you thought you were going to find out about, you know. But I think it's gradually getting there. As I say, I feel less sure now than I did, 6 months ago, but I know I'm feeling less sure for the right reasons.
Any other comments? Yes, Chris? I want to read every word you write. That is so relevant to me as principal to get that kind of understanding. I can't help think, I guess you're familiar with C2C.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of thinking, when I think about my school, the people who manage C2C, when we tried it for a short time, were those with routine expertise and the teachers with adaptive expertise. Actually, it was almost like the opposite of what theory predicts. They were very stressed out by it.
Yeah, yeah, because they're too restricted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So their adaptive expertise teacher in the classroom didn't enable them to adapt to this restrictive curriculum.
No, the No Child Left Behind thing in America was the same. The scripted pedagogy was very stressful to anybody that knew what they're actually doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, so that's an element as well, isn't it? The reverse. Yeah.
Alex, I've got a question just about where you were talking about you've got the routine expert. This is like a genuine question. And then you've got the adaptive expert. It sort of implies that they're two different people. But do you have to have the routine automatized sort of processes in place in order to be adaptive? Like it's not an either or, it's an and?
No, it's an and because an adaptive expert is one who has got routines that they're expert in, but has the development growth, has a growth approach towards their skill set, I guess, and is actively interrogating their own ability to change, making what is tacit more overt, refining it, and then making it back into a process again. Sorry?
They're often set up as binaries,
Yeah,
aren't they?
yeah.
These are
I think I'm negotiating that at the moment.
is bad, but actually I could see that one's foundational to the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think, as I say, I think I'm conceptualizing that as we speak, I guess, because we like to put things into, we like to classify things and say this is that and that's that, and it's not. That's that. That is that when you do this. Like, it's, where is the bit in the middle? And that's what Glasser and Berlin were talking about. The different mental models that you can see when a person you can identify as an adaptive expert, they put the knowledge of their processes together in a different way. Makes them more versatile, I guess. But I think a lot of it's approach. What approach do you have? Do you have an approach where you say, I'm going to learn how to do this really well because then I can go down the pub? Or do I get to be able to do this really well so then I can find another problem to work on and then make that into a procedure that I can call on without thinking and then go and find the next thing to be really good at? And there's a definite difference between those two. There's one will build their resource bank up of processes in order to just make the whole job easier because they don't have to think much. But when a change comes along, they don't have the ability to move.
Yeah, I was just thinking through this place too has been through the most massive couple of years of change in every dimension. And some of the people who've suffered most, in my observation, are those who were brilliant at their routine work. But I'm just sitting here thinking through perhaps, and trying to jump off Mark's question, perhaps their identity was in being the master of a particular way we did things, and the added element of, and I can change and become that good at something else, is perhaps what's the difference between those that have really suffered and those that have found ways to thrive.
Yeah. I think you can see in musicians that have a certain level of longevity where they'll change. They'll move into jazz and they'll move into a different form and they'll try a different instrument and they're always putting themselves in the position of being the beginner.
Yeah. And that, I think, has been the unsettling thing for people to suddenly...
Some people don't want to be in that position.
Yeah.
They just want to be in control of what they're... Don't change my class, for God's sake. Don't change my curriculum, for God's sake. Because I'm very, very comfortable and really good here.
Yeah, because it's not just comfortable, but good at it.
Yeah.
Good at it.
Yeah. Well, that's the argument that we've always had. Like, I come from a technology background, which makes qualitative really hard. But just getting teachers to try new tools. Why should I? My whiteboard markers work pretty fine for the last 20 years. I've got kids that have got good results. Why am I going to bother rewriting and putting stuff into OneNote or having a whiz-bang, algebra app that I use? So that sort of thing is happening all the time. I mean, it's not just teaching. I mean, it'd be any profession where there's a level of expertise that you can survive at over a long period of time and convince you and lots of other people that you're really good. And probably most of the time you are. But an adaptive expert would say, I'm good at that, now what's next?
So has anyone else got just one other thing?
I've just got a comment. I really loved your presentation today, Alex. That was fantastic. So I found it very inspiring as someone who's worked a lot with teachers in terms of professional learning as well. I really liked the idea of your activity theory and looking at the lens of adaptive expertise. I think that was a great sort of approach. So I really enjoyed that. So
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. So I'll jump off your point. I just wanted to give you an example that may or may not be useful. One of my students, who's also an EdD student, her thesis is actually out to examination, so there is an end, I'd just like to say. And she used activity theory, particularly Engstrom's version. And you were talking about maybe video and some way to capture process. And she was looking at homework in foreign language teaching. Right? Japanese specifically. Because to learn a second language, a big part of the theory is you need a lot of exposure. Well, how do you get exposure when you've got 1 hour a week? Right? So homework becomes important. So what she did is she gave it was a case study, and she observed teachers, and then she gave the kids who were primary school kids learning Japanese 4, 5 and 6, so grade 4, 5 and 6, iPads to video themselves during the process of doing homework. And then she applied activity theory to try and understand what was the outcome, to explain the outcome of the completed homework task, right? And so she was able to identify those different points in the framework. And one thing that was new that came out, I'm not allowed to say this because this is a big finding and she'll kill me, was that one of the, what's the top one? Mediating tools for these kids doing their homework was what's called languaging. And the kids talked aloud. And through their self-talk, they were mediating completion of the task. So you hear them, you see these little kids, they've forgotten about the fact that the video's on, and they're going, so what do I have to do? How do I say it? Wa, ta, shi, no. And you hear them talking to themselves, and they're mediating their own accomplishment of the task. And that theory, activity theory, the mediating artifact in this case was language, was self-talk, and it's really powerful. And then she followed up and triangulated that with an interview with the kids.
Yeah.
What are you doing here? Look, what are you doing there? And got them to explain it.
Yeah,
Sometimes
that's
they
good.
didn't even realise they were doing it.
No, and that Vygotsky did a lot of that with use of language and signs, originally. So yeah, that fits. Yeah.
So she found that sort of use of the video.
Yeah.
Really
So it's let's say you're cross-reffing one data source with another and trying to find meaning. And I think that's why I think originally Dave or Alberto came up with the idea of what about if you video this and then interview afterwards, so you can get that analysis of person's actions. So that's interesting.
So I just offer that as a suggestion.
So in that case, Mark, that video will be taken over an extended period of time?
Yes, extended period of time in that it was sort of snapshots of homework over a term.
I think this is going to be one of the challenges that Alex faces, marrying up the contextual change with the time frame of the data. Video recording a lesson will capture the way the teacher dynamically adapts to what might happen in that lesson. But then the example you gave of rewriting the senior curriculum, that's a
Yeah.
3-year journey.
Yeah, one of the advantages of activity theory is you can use it like a microscope, telescope combined, in that you can zoom out and zoom in, and you can see activity at different levels. It's like a fractal. Like you get and at each level you've got slightly different communities, slightly different. Like all those elements are slightly different. But as you say, which bit do you focus on? Given the time, the time scale is always going to be the enemy.
All right. Any other questions, comments? Good. Perfect timing.
Thank you.